So with that, I'd like to close the session and now move on to our next session, and the chair is Dylan Schell. Take it away, Dylan.
Thank you, Dimitri. So I'm going to say a few words of introduction for Henny, but in order to not use any of your time, perhaps you can see if you can set that up and get the AV stuff working. So it's an enormous pleasure for me to have the opportunity to introduce Henny Admoni, who has been selected to give our next talk, which is the first invited early career spotlight for RSS 2022. Henny has a joint BS-MA degree from Wesleyan University. She then decided to stay in Connecticut and take her PhD and master's degrees from Yale University, and then she became a postdoc at CMU. And in the present tense, she is currently the A. Nico Haberman Assistant Professor at the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. At CMU, she directs the Human and Robot Partners Lab, and her work blends aspects of robotics, computer science, and cognitive psychology to build algorithms that are both mathematically rigorous and grounded in human behavior research. Her results, some of which I'm sure she's going to touch on today, consider robot systems that can provide assistance in complex tasks in human environments. They have a focus on modeling and identifying implicit signals that are expressed in human behavior form. And one example of this, which she'll talk about, I think, is gaze, but by no means is that the limit of her research. She's also looked at instances where they study natural language instructions. You've perhaps seen her talk about her work at other venues, such as IEEE ICRA or IROS or HRI, a conference that she's been very involved in terms of the service. She's been very devoted to service as part of that community. She's also published with the ACM at CHI and ACM SIG Access, and a range of, I guess, what to me as a slight outsider look like human factors venues, I think. We first met at a wine bar after RSS 2017, I guess, which is, where the important part of the conference happens afterwards. And the conferences were fading in my mind, but I remember everyone else in the room seemed to know Henny, and I was the last to find out. So that was a real pleasure. She then went on to be a co-chair of RSS Pioneers the following year. And she gave an inspirational talk as part of the RSS Good Citizens and in Robotics Research panel a year later, I think, after that. She's quite well known, I think, for her advocacy for accessibility and disability awareness. And she was a co-organizer of a workshop at CMU. So when she was at Yale, she co-authored a very influential survey paper called Robots for Use in Autism Research. And that's sort of, I guess, a highly impactful paper at the beginning of your career. And I'm going to make a guess for a paper which you published just this year, which I think will turn out to be a highly impactful paper. And it's titled Harmonic, Human and Robot Multimodal Observations of Natural Interactive Collaboration. And this is an example of a data set paper. And if you were particularly astute or were paying really close attention, you will have caught the fact that her lab is called the Human and Robot Partners Lab, which has the acronym HARP. So we have HARP and Harmony, so there's a bit of a theme going on there. She's been sponsored by, her research has been sponsored by ONR, Paralyzed Veterans of America Foundation, Sony Corporation, and the US National Science Foundation. She's specifically the recipient of an NSF Career Award for a project entitled Towards Proactive Assistive Robotics. And her talk today is entitled 5 Traps for Human Robots in Human Environments and How to Avoid Them. Please join me in welcoming our next speaker.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wow. I wish I had Dylan to introduce me every day. Thank you for that lovely and the best dressed introduction I've ever gotten. And thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to talk to you about why we should think about humans and human environments when we develop robots. So I come from the field of human-robot interaction, and we have a pretty good view in this field that's kind of between robotics and more human factors areas of what it means to put a robot into a human environment. And we have this dream, I think, communally, that robots will be seamlessly integrated into our environments. They'll be able to live in our homes. They'll be able to serve us food or clean up after us. Maybe we don't want them to teach our elderly father how to perform bank heists, but in general, we want them to be integrated into our environment. But we don't have this yet. Instead, what we have is a lot of robots that go out into human environments and really piss people off. So you can see all of these are real headlines about how robots run over toddlers or get vandalized or are fired for utter incompetence. And this is not obviously what we want out of robotics. So the big question that we have to ask ourselves is why? What is happening here that is causing all of our amazing work not to be translatable when we put robots out into the world? So in this talk, I'm going to go through 5 big traps or 5 assumptions that we as roboticists often make about the human environments that we're putting robots into. I'm going to explain from my own research and my lab's research why those assumptions fail, and then I'll give you a take-home message for what you can do to address that assumption. So let's start with trap number 1. Assuming humans are oracles for training data. So there's been a lot of robot learning work at this conference. Unsurprising, robot learning is an incredible area with a lot of progress. Anybody who does interactive robot learning knows that you can get data from people to speed up your learning process. For those of you who don't know how interactive robot learning works, typically you start with some kind of learning objective and the constraints. So what do you want to learn? You perform some kind of interaction to get data. You might query an expert, you might watch demonstrations. Then the robot interprets that data in some way and learns from it, and you get your learning outcome. Now, a lot of robot learning happens with synthetic data, or data that the robot gets from itself, like self-supervised data, which is a great way of starting off the system. But often we see situations where we kind of assume that we can just drop in a human and into the same place that that synthetic data was, and we'll get similar data from the human as we were using before. And that the human data is just as good as the synthetic data. But the reality is that humans are actually incredibly context sensitive, and that the performance of the person really changes the kinds of data that the robot has access to. And it changes how the robot should be interpreting that data if it wants to learn. So let me talk to you about the kinds of data that people are capable of providing. This is not going to be new to anybody who does learning, but I want you to try to identify your own learning algorithms in this chart. So we can think about human feedback as having some kind of input from the robot to the human, and then the human outputs some kind of information or data for the robot to learn from. Showing interactions are like learning from demonstration, right? The robot actually doesn't do anything. It just watches while an expert provides some sort of example that it can learn from. But people also teach in other ways. So we have categorizing interactions. These are situations where the robot demonstrates what it's learned, presents one example to the person, and they can respond with a label. That label can be as simple as good or bad, or it can be more complex. In this case, the robot has to provide the example for the human to report on. Sorting feedback is given when the robot provides 2 or more examples to a person, and they have to organize those examples in terms of quality. In this case, you just get relative benefit. And evaluating examples, or evaluating feedback happens when the robot again provides one example and the human gives a critique or a correction. So the human explains what part of that example isn't working and what should work better. So again, those of you who do interactive learning probably recognize your learning systems in this table, and researchers, in fact, have even combined different kinds of learning methods in order to improve the rate of robot learning. Why do we care about different ways that robots can learn? Why do we not only ask people for the most informative learning feedback type at any particular time? The reality is that it's not just about what data the robot can get from the human, it's about what data the human is capable of providing. So critically, these different learning interactions present a different amount of cognitive load onto the human teacher. So for example, well, actually, I'll show you. We actually measured this. We proved this empirically. We don't need to speculate. We gave people a task of training a lunar lander, so giving all of those different feedback types, corrections and demonstrations and so on, into a lunar lander system. And then we measured the cognitive load that they were under when they were dealing with each feedback type. So how do you measure cognitive load? One objective way is to give people a secondary task. So this is something else that they need to monitor, and the amount of attention they have to give to that task is a rough estimate of how much is left over after they have attended to their primary task, which in this case is the teaching interaction. So the worse they do on the secondary task, the more load we know they have given their primary task. And what we found quantitatively is that sorting interactions where people had to give preferences between cases was actually harder for people than categorizing interactions where they could just say good or bad, right? Some of you might recognize these kinds of interfaces. So objectively, we can see that sorting is harder than categorizing. We can also ask people, we can look for subjective measures of cognitive load, ask people how difficult the task was for them. And in those cases, we also find that sorting is harder than categorizing. And additionally, we find that evaluating is harder than everything. So if you're asking people to provide a critique or a correction, they perceive that as more cognitively taxing than they do sorting, and they perceive sorting as more cognitively taxing than they do categorizing. So in summary, the key take-home I want you to learn from this first section is that when you get data from humans, that data is going to be variable and contextual. You can use that to your advantage, for example, by getting different kinds of data that teach the robot different things, but you also need to understand what kinds of constraints the human is under so that you know how to interpret that data properly. Okay, so we're no longer going to assume that humans are oracles when we train our robots. Our next trap is assuming that humans won't change during an interaction. So very often we see situations where robots are trying to adapt to people, or they're trying to learn preferences. But these often have a fixed human model that the robot is trying to move closer to, where the reality is that humans and robots are mutually adapting all the time. So some of the work I did in my postdoc looked at the human experience of shared control. In this particular case, in the video that's playing, you can see a shared control task where a robot is helping a human spear a piece of food and eat it. We can see, obviously, that the shared autonomy method that takes the human goals into account and tries to assist is faster and apparently easier to use, actually measurably easier to use, than the teleoperation case. This shared control system works by taking in user input from the joystick. So the system inputs continuous observations of joystick control. It performs some kind of goal recognition on those inputs. So it tries to predict, given some known goals, which one the human is trying to control the robot to achieve. And then it picks the right action given those goals. And this is all modeled as a POMDP because there's uncertainties over which goal the human has, and so the robot can represent that uncertainty with a POMDP. But what we find is that when the robot is using this process, that first input block, the amount of observations that the robot gets, goes way down. So when we measure how much time people spend in each of their joystick control modes, so how much they move the joystick in each of the directions that's possible, as a function of whether they're in shared control mode or teleoperation, we see that in shared control mode, people almost never leave the XY mode. So they almost never give the robot any information in terms of orientation, in terms of rotation or Z position. Whereas in the teleoperation mode, they have to spend their time much more equally. And in fact, I don't have the charts to show it, but they actually give us less information overall, even beyond this disproportionality. What this means is that as the robot is helping the human is giving the robot less information upon which the robot should use to help the human. And this is something that we need to be aware of because it's going to affect the ability of the system to continue to interact in the future with the person. Now we have a question, though. This was a brief example of how people adapt to a robot's assistance. Can the robot do that intentionally? We asked in our lab, can we make a robot actually alter a user's decision through its own behavior? And we did this by setting up a collaborative picking task where a human had to pick a particular bin out of 3 bins, and the robot handed that bin to the human. And as a reward, the human got a piece of candy. So highly motivating task. We put an eye tracker in front of people, and so we could track where they were looking while they were surveying their different candy options to select which bin they wanted. And you can see here there's a heat map of eye gaze over different bins, and one of the bins is clearly being attended to the most. We say that that's the preferred user target. And then we had the robot either collaborate with our humans, so assist them by beginning to move closer to that bin before the human pressed a button to make their selection. That's the collaborative robot. Or we had an adversarial robot that started to move away from the bin before the human pressed the button. And we wanted to see if the adversarial robot could cause people to change the bin that they were going to select because it influenced their decision. And it's very hard to quantify this, but we did find through the free responses, the sort of open-ended responses at the end of the study, that there was an effect of collaborative versus adversarial robots. So people who saw the collaborative robot in this task said things like, as soon as I made the decision in my head, I noticed the robot move directly in front of the candy I wanted. Or, the robot seemed to guess my choice well in the last trial. The more I have interfaced with the robot, the more it understood me. Like, people think the robot understands them. In the adversarial case, on the other hand, people said things like, I felt like the robot wanted me to choose the middle bin after moving there. I picked a different bin than the one I originally wanted due to this, right? So people are telling us that the robot is changing their behavior. Some people didn't really care what the robot wanted. The robot moved to be close to one box. I guess if I wanted the robot to work less, I would have chosen that box, but the wrapper color was not appealing to me. Right? In other words, people adapt to the kinds of assistance and behavior that robots are providing. And so as robots are selecting that assistance, they need to be able to model the fact that that human is changing, that the model upon which the robot is basing its assistance is also changing. The third trap is that when we try to understand, when we try to model human understanding of a robot, so we try to model how well a human can interpret a robot's behavior, we often try to use the tools at hand, which are our algorithms. When in fact, that is not the way that people process information. So there's a whole there's a whole area in learning and human-guided learning that thinks about how robots can demonstrate back to humans what the robot is capable of in order to make the robot policy or the underlying robot framework more transparent to people. So our idea, and this is actually a trap that we fell into, so I'll tell you what we fell into and how we got out of it. Our idea is that we could show robot demonstrations, so show demonstrations to people that allow the person to most optimally understand what the robot policy was. And we were going to do that by modeling the person as an inverse reinforcement learner and then optimizing for demonstrations that would maximize the inverse reinforcement learning capability. So to do this, I'll introduce briefly this grid world domain. We have an agent, which blue triangle. It's trying to deliver a package to a destination, and it wants to avoid yellow boxes, which represent tolls, and it may or may not go to collect the battery, which represents a small boost in its score. So this kind of environment can be described as a linear combination of reward features with weights. And in this particular problem, the teaching task is to get the human to understand the weights that the robot is putting on each of these different features. So the robot might provide a demonstration that looks something like this dotted line appearing on the screen. And from that, the human can start to infer the relative magnitude of the different weights to each other. So before the human sees any information, they have no idea how the weights relate to each other, and so we can model the weights as lying on this unit sphere that's in the space of possible reward weights. Every demonstration that the human gets cuts this sphere down into smaller and smaller areas because of the information that's being provided by the robot. And this isn't our work, this is based on prior work by Brown and Neekum. So for example, if you had a demonstration like what's shown on the screen, this would yield two different constraints in the reward weight, so it would cut down the reward space. The first constraint, because the robot detours around this yellow box, you, the human, now know that the yellow box is not something that you want to go through. And not only that, but you know that it's twice as expensive as the white boxes because the robot took 2 extra steps to get around it instead of taking 1 step through the box. We also know that the robot tried to take the mostly shortest possible path to the goal. It didn't run around in the map, which means that step cost is negative, or step reward is negative, I guess. There's a cost to taking steps. And what's left after you cut out these different areas of the reward space is an area where all of the different reward weights could have led to this demonstration. So we call that a behavioral equivalence class. Now, prior work has shown us how to optimize our behavioral equivalence class demonstrations. So how to pick the fewest possible demonstrations that provide the most specifics, the smallest behavioral equivalence class. And so our idea was, great, humans are sort of inverse reinforcement learners, so maybe we can model human learning this way, and we'll just pick the demonstrations according to this method that lead to the smallest BEC area. And what we found is that it's really hard. So these are the 2 demonstrations you would get in this particular weighting of these rewards. I want you to take a minute to look at it and see if you can figure out what the relative weights are of the yellow square, the green hexagon, and the drop-off, or the step cost. It's not easy. We stared at it for a while. And what we realized, finally, is that people are not inverse reinforcement learners. They're not imitation learners. They're not any kind of particular algorithmic process that we often try to use to model them. So our initial idea of modeling people as IRL learners was no good. We threw it out, and we updated it with the fact that when people are seeing demonstrations, we can make those demonstrations understandable by taking advantage of the fact that we already know how people learn in educational sciences. So we turned to psychology and education science, and we looked at what are the techniques that teachers use to convey information to people in other kinds of educational settings. And we found 3 factors that we were able to implement into our system: visual simplicity, similarity, and scaffolding. Visual simplicity means that each demonstration should be as uncluttered and simple as possible. So we don't want any extra information that isn't involved in providing the demonstration. We want the option on top that has no extra yellow distractor tolls. Visual similarity means that successive demonstrations should be similar. So every demonstration that you give should build on the one before, because people are not Markovian, and should try to change as little as possible while moving towards a more informative state. And finally, we know that people scaffold information. So they start from the simplest information and they work their way up to more complex information. We ran a study to see if the system actually worked, and we found that BEC area could actually be a good measure of how difficult a particular task was, a particular test was for people to complete. So after we showed people these examples, we gave them a new environment in which they showed us their the optimal trajectory of the robot. And as the BEC area of that environment got smaller, people performed less and less well. It was harder and harder to do. We also showed that visual simplicity and visual similarity did improve performance when people were asked to demonstrate in difficult environments. So we showed that these concepts from education actually did apply to the inverse reinforcement learning system. Unfortunately, we didn't find an effect of scaffolding in this work. We actually have follow-up work that's in submission, so I'm not talking about it here, that does start to show how scaffolding can be used for improving the model of the learner. But the take-home message from this kind of slide or this experiment is that if we know how people process information, we can provide better information to them. And the robot can communicate more efficiently if it knows how people process information. Two more. As Dylan very kindly said, I did a lot of my work on nonverbal communication. My whole PhD thesis was on it. So I'm obviously a fan of nonverbal communication. But our fourth trap is that it is possible to rely too much on nonverbal communication, or not enough. So I'm going to actually, in the interest of time, briefly skip ahead. So back to that shared control example. When we watch someone do this shared control task with a robot where they need to spear a morsel, we see a lot of nonverbal behavior that we can take advantage of. And in particular, we looked at eye gaze, where people were looking, as a measure of which goal they were trying to target with the robot, because we know that people look at their target object. So we put eye trackers on people while they did this task. This is what it looks like from the egocentric eye tracker view. The pink dot represents the human's eye gaze. And what we thought we would find is that eye gaze spent a lot of time on the target so that we could easily pick out which is the target morsel that people wanted. And what we actually find, as you can see, is that eye gaze spends a lot of time on the robot end effector, which is what the human is controlling. And they have no proprioception for it, so of course they're looking at it a lot. In other words, the eye gaze to the goal that we thought we would find is pretty sparse. In fact, only 16% of the fixations that people made were actually to their target morsel. And 10% of the time, we saw no gaze to the target morsel at all. So gaze turns out to be quite an unreliable signal. We address this by building a sequential model that can take into account a series of gaze fixations using hidden Markov models in order to try to better model how gaze moves around for each goal. So briefly, we trained a hidden Markov model for each particular goal in the system. We scored, given a sequence of fixations, we scored that sequence for each goal, and the probability of the goal given that sequence was proportional to its score with that particular hidden Markov model. What we found is that we can actually use eye gaze to improve the shared autonomy method that I showed you before. So gaze can outperform joystick in certain situations, but when gaze is wrong, it's very confidently wrong. So the system is really sure of the wrong answer. And here's an example of that. Here the human is trying to pick up the right-hand object. And you can see they briefly glance at the left-hand object. And after that, our system is convinced that what they want is to go to the left. And they are completely incapable through the joystick of convincing the system otherwise. And so it hyperfixates on this left-hand object. People are looking at the left-hand object just because they're trying to get away from it and because that's where the robot is. And it doesn't help, and so they have to fight the robot for a while. In other words, you can use, nonverbals are very powerful. You can get a lot out of nonverbal signals, but they're also noisy and sparse, which means you have to use them carefully. And my student Ruben, in the next session, will talk more about that particular study. The last trap is thinking that robots have to look or act like human beings. So in order to talk about this work, this is some work we did with augmented communicators who use AAC devices to speak. One of the most famous AAC device users, Stephen Hawking, and lots of people use these kinds of devices that might have keyboards or pictures where they select either words or letters in order to communicate. So here's an example of an augmented communicator using her AAC device to select words on the screen. And she uses her joystick to pick the words and then the button to hit enter, essentially, to say what she's typed. So I'm going to show you a video of what it looks like to use this kind of device. Here the experimenter has asked our augmented communicator a question, and her father, who's sitting next to her, starts to talk while she's typing. No, we don't get any sound. Okay, that's fine. Dad is talking. Just imagine that he's speaking. And in a minute, the video will speed up. It's fine. It's not a big deal. Thank you. Because it takes a long time. So you can kind of see the words start to appear on the device on the left, but it takes a while for people to have, be able to produce these words. And in that time, the conversation has often moved on. And so what we wanted to know is, can we use a robot in place of the dad, right, in place of this support system, to help somebody maintain their role, their place in the conversation? Now, a conversation is a three-way interaction. You have the augmented communicator, you have somebody who's playing this support role, and you have a third party who the augmented communicator is talking to. In order to figure out if robots could be helpful here, we held a participatory design workshop with a couple of augmented communicators and their close conversational partners, and we also invited puppeteers who are experts in communicating through movement. And we had a whole day workshop where they designed different robots and explained what do they imagine a robot could possibly do to help them maintain their conversational agency. Here are some ideas that they came up with. And from these ideas, like filling a silence gap or letting the augmented communicator take a turn, we developed a series of different robot actions, very, very simple actions, really just a flag waving around that were communicative of the different concepts. We prototyped this on an augmented communicator's wheelchair. He used it for about 2 months, and we sort of qualitatively evaluated how well that system worked to help him maintain his conversational agency. Now, I want to point out that this robot is really simple. This is really not a complex robot. It does not look like a human in really any meaningful way, but we did see that it could actually support his role in the conversation. So he could use that robot in the way that he might use eye gaze or body language in a conversational setting to hold the conversational floor or to indicate that he wants a turn. In other words, robots can take advantage of these kinds of social signals that humans use all the time, even if they have minimal human-like features. Okay, this is a very short talk. I went through the 5 traps very quickly. I want to leave you with this final thought. When we are thinking about putting robots in human environments, we know that people are complex, but the reality is that people will often adapt to robots. They will work with your robots in order to become successful on the task. So don't be afraid of that. I want to acknowledge the incredible team at Harp Lab that has done this work, and as well as our collaborators, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you for your attention.
Do we have any questions?
Thank you for the amazing talk. So I just have a more general question. So I feel like a lot of the talk today, you went over how to improve robots' understanding of human in the context of human-robot interaction. I'm wondering, have you looked into how to improve humans' understanding of robots? Because I imagine in some of the examples you gave in the second slide, some of the issues are actually caused by people maybe feeling the robots a bit oppressive in some sense. So I'm wondering your thoughts on that front. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So the question is about, do we think about human understanding of robots? And I think that's critical for a couple of situations. So some of the work that I showed is about people understanding robots, like the third one, so human understanding and how robots can model human understanding in order to be more transparent to people. But it's critical for trust, as you say. It's critical for collaboration. If people don't know how a robot works, they're not going to be able to use it optimally, or they might not use it at all. And when we think about the pressures that, as roboticists, we're under to not put out scary robots, we want to make our robots as understandable as possible to try to avoid situations like what you just talked about.
Thank you.
Hi, Sabrina Newman. I'm a postdoc at Harvard. I was wondering what you think about other avenues for humans to perceive things that the robots are going through, like haptics, things like that. Do you think there's feedback paths that would help people intuit what the robot's experience is? Is that useful?
Yes. Haptics is actually in the slide that I skipped, so I'll play it now. So haptics is another great signal for having people understand robots. So actually, you know what, I'm not going to play this. Come find me after if you want to see this video. Because your question was about, can we use haptics to help people understand what the robot is perceiving? Absolutely. The challenge with a lot of the teleoperation work, for example, is that people don't have a haptic sense of what the robot is manipulating. And that makes it very hard to do manipulations because we as people are very, very sensitive to what's in our hands. So robot haptics is very, very important. We often don't see robots communicating, like touching people. And so that's a challenge for the community to do more physical human-robot interaction. I think we avoid it because it's challenging and potentially unsafe. But I think that that's a huge avenue for human-robot interaction that is pretty underexplored.
Very cool, thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to have to ask the other questioner to hold that and maybe catch up with you afterwards because we're a little bit behind. So let's thank one more.
Thank you all.